The chain around Cale's wrist was too tight, and he could feel his pulse pressing against the iron with every second that passed. He kept his breathing slow. He kept his face still. Panic was something other people gave into, and panic in a place like this had one outcome. It drove the price up, or it attracted the wrong kind of buyer. Both of those things were problems Cale intended to avoid. The underground pit beneath the trade city of Asveth smelled like wet stone, old smoke, and the kind of damp that lived in spaces below the ground where light rarely reached. Iron brackets ran along the walls at shoulder height, each one holding a torch, and the orange light from those torches moved across the faces of the men standing in the gallery above. Cale counted them without turning his head more than absolutely necessary. 31 buyers, 12 guards, 4 handlers who moved between the people lined up on the floor of the pit, and the auctioneer at the front. One man in a gray coat, standing completely apart from everyone else near the far wall on the upper level, who had not looked at anyone but Cale since Cale stepped through the entry door 12 minutes ago. Cale noted that man, filed his face, his coat, the ring on his right hand, the way his left leg carried his weight slightly differently than his right. Then he moved on, and kept counting. The auctioneer was a short man with a voice that filled the room in a way that seemed too large for his size. He moved down the line of people with quick hands and practiced words, describing each person the way someone at a market described items on a table. He spoke about height and weight, about age, about what skills could be verified, and what histories were on record. He said nothing about any of them as people, because in this room, that was not the framework being used. When the auctioneer reached Cale, the man stopped. The pause lasted longer than any of the others had. Cale could feel the attention of the gallery shift, the way the air in a room shifted when many people turned to look at one thing. Then the auctioneer smiled, and that smile was the most dangerous thing that had happened to Cale in the 3 months since he was taken. Not because it was cruel, because it was excited. 17 years old, the auctioneer began. Omega classification, confirmed through formal evaluation by 2 independent examiners. No recorded history of flight attempts. No recorded history of resistance during handling. No corrective marks anywhere in his file. He paused again, and he completed all 3 of the standard evaluation tests with a perfect score. The gallery went quiet. A perfect score was not common. The tests were built to be difficult, not because the tasks themselves were hard, but because the conditions under which they were given were designed to cause distress. The first test was memory-based. A handler read 17 items from a list once, at a normal pace, without repeating anything, and the person being tested was expected to recite the full list in order within 60 seconds. Most people remembered between 9 and 12. Cale recited all 17 in 41 seconds. The second test was instruction-based. 2 handlers gave alternating commands, sometimes overlapping, sometimes contradicting, and the person being tested had to identify the correct order of priority and act accordingly, without being told what the priority system was. Cale determined the system within the first 30 seconds by noticing that the handler on the left always gave the higher priority instruction whenever there was a genuine conflict. He followed every command correctly from that point on. The third test was designed to cause panic. 2 men stood close and spoke loudly and simultaneously. A third stood behind the person being tested and moved objects on a shelf without warning. The person being tested was asked, at the end, how many objects had moved and where they were now. Most people did not notice the objects at all. Cale named all 7, described each one with enough detail that the examiner asked him to confirm twice, and gave their new positions to within an inch of accuracy. He had not done any of this to achieve a perfect score. He had done it because there was no version of any situation in which giving less than his full attention to everything around him was a strategy that made sense. He had been paying full attention to everything around him since he was old enough to understand that paying attention was the only kind of control that could not be taken away from him. The bidding started high. The woman chained beside Cale made a small sound when the opening number was called. Cale watched the man in the gray coat raise one finger. The auction moved quickly. 3 buyers dropped out in the first 90 seconds. The price climbed to a level where only 4 bidders remained, and then 3, and then 2. The man in the gray coat kept raising that same single finger each time someone went above him, without hurrying, without looking away from Cale. He did not look like someone competing. He looked like someone completing a transaction he had already decided to complete before he arrived. Men who looked like that were the most careful kind of problem. Men who bought desperately were reckless. Men who bought calmly had plans. And a man with a plan was a man who thought ahead, and men who thought ahead were harder to move past than men who acted on impulse. Cale stored that assessment and kept watching. The second-to-last remaining bidder went above the gray-coated man one final time. The man in gray raised his finger. The bidder shook his head and stepped back. The auctioneer looked once around the gallery, and then brought his wooden block down with a sharp, flat sound that echoed off the stone walls. 6 minutes later, in a side room lit by 2 lamps and a narrow window showing a sliver of dark sky, Cale was brought before the man in the gray coat. The man looked at him the way a builder looked at materials he intended to use, not with cruelty, not with disregard, but with a measuring quality that was in some ways harder to deal with than either of those things. Men who were cruel underestimated the people they hurt. Men who measured accurately did not. His name was Vorn. "Your name," Vorn said. It was not a question. It was a test of how quickly and directly Cale would answer. "Cale, can you read?" "Yes." "Write?" "Yes." "How many languages?" "3," Cale said. He did not explain that 2 of them were self-taught. He answered the question that was asked. Vorn was quiet for a moment. "I paid more for you tonight than I have paid for a single acquisition in 3 years, he said. "I expect a return on that. Do you understand what that means?" "You expect a return," Cale said. "Yes," Vorn said. "What would you like me to do?" The question was simple and gave nothing away. Vorn's expression did not change, but something in the quality of his stillness shifted very slightly, the way a room's temperature changed by a single degree. "Nothing tonight," Vorn said. "Tonight you learn where you are. Tomorrow you start." The compound outside Asveth's walls was large and well-maintained, set inside its own secondary wall of stone. The interior of the main house was clean. The furniture was old but in excellent condition. There were no visible chains in the common areas. No guards at every internal doorway. It looked, from the outside, almost like a household run by someone with money, and organization, and a preference for order. It took Cale less than 1 hour to understand why none of that meant what it appeared to mean. The people who worked in the house moved with a particular quality of precision that did not come from training, but from a very long time of understanding exactly what happened when you moved differently. They spoke only when directly addressed. They did not make eye contact without permission. They moved from task to task without pausing to rest or look around, not because they feared being seen pausing, but because they had been in this place long enough that pausing no longer seemed like something available to them. Control that required no visible enforcement was the most complete kind. It meant the person running things had taken enough time and been consistent enough in the consequences of error that everyone had already made their internal calculations and arrived at the same conclusion. Testing the boundaries was not worth it. A woman named Nora took Cale to a room on the ground floor of the East Wing and told him the morning schedule in a quiet, efficient way that covered everything he needed to know and nothing extra. "What time does the East Gate open in the morning?" Cale asked. She paused. "5th bell." "And the rear of the house?" "I saw what looked like a service corridor." "You will use the main hallways," Nora said. "The service areas are assigned. Ask before you go anywhere you have not been shown." She left. In those 2 answers, Cale had learned 3 things. The East Gate opened at the 5th bell, just before dawn. The service corridors existed and were restricted by assignment. And Nora did not ask why he wanted to know, because she had trained herself not to be curious, because curiosity led to noticing, and noticing led to thinking, and thinking made this place harder to survive. He sat on the narrow bed in his room and went through everything he had observed since arriving in Asveth. The pit, the buyers, guards, handlers, exits, the drainage pipe along the east wall. The guard rotation he had clocked at 22 minutes, with a gap of 3 minutes near the eastern corridor on each cycle. The transport to the compound. The road, the unguarded river crossing, the loose latch on the cargo door. The compound, the external wall. The gate and the guard's habit of looking left before right. The windows he had counted on the way in. The layout of the main floor. The 2 staircases he had seen, and the likely position of others he had not yet confirmed. And there was one other thing. When Vorn leaned forward to sign the transfer papers, his left sleeve had shifted up his forearm for approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Cale had seen marks on the skin. He had looked at them the way he looked at everything, carefully, completely, without reacting in any way that would draw attention to the fact that he was seeing them. The marks were not scars from injury. They were too geometric, too deliberate. They were arranged in lines and clusters that suggested a system, not random damage. They reminded him of something he had once seen in the back pages of a cartography reference, a notation system used by route surveyors to mark terrain points and junctions in a shorthand that others who knew the system could read. He was not certain yet what they were. He had only seen 4 seconds of forearm, but he was going to find a way to see more. He lay back and let himself think slowly and without rushing. Incomplete information was not a reason to stop thinking. It was a reason to think more carefully, to identify what was missing and figure out how to fill in the gaps without letting anyone know that was what he was doing. Somewhere else in the house, in a study with a lamp burning low, Vorn wrote one word next to Cale's name in the acquisition record. The word was useful. He capped the pen and did not think about the boy again that night. He had no idea that the boy he had just purchased was lying in the dark in the East Wing, replaying every second of every observation from the last 5 hours with complete and unbroken accuracy, and quietly building the earliest possible frame of something that was not yet a plan, but was already pointing in the direction of one. He had no idea that the detail which would eventually bring everything crashing down on him had already been seen, already been stored, and was already being thought about, in a way that would not stop until it was finished. He had no idea at all. And that was the first mistake. Cale had been in Vorn's compound for 11 days before he understood fully what the marks on Vorn's skin were. He had not rushed to that understanding. Rushing anything in a place like this was a way to make errors, and errors had costs he was not in a position to afford. So he worked. He arrived at every assigned station at the correct time. He completed every task with exactly the level of thoroughness expected, not more and not less, because too much visible effort attracted attention the same way too little did. He spoke when spoken to, answered questions directly, and never asked anything that could not be explained by a practical need. And in every available moment, he watched Vorn. This was easier than it might have been somewhere else, because his primary duties put him in the rooms where Vorn spent most of his time. His job was to maintain the records in the main study, to prepare the documents Vorn needed for business meetings, and to be present during certain conversations when someone was needed to write things down quickly and accurately. That last duty was the most valuable one, not because Cale learned anything in those meetings that he did not already suspect, but because those meetings put him in the same room as Vorn repeatedly, at close distance, with legitimate reasons to have his eyes open and his attention on everything. The marks on Vorn's skin were visible in different places, depending on what Vorn was wearing and what he was doing. Cale saw them in pieces. A section of the left forearm during a document signing on the 4th day. A portion of the right upper arm during a morning in the 2nd week when Vorn worked through a heat that required lighter clothing. A glimpse of what ran across the left side of Vorn's neck when the man leaned over a table for a long moment in poor light, and the collar of his shirt fell slightly wrong. Each piece was filed. Each piece was remembered with the kind of accuracy that Cale had possessed since childhood, without fully understanding what it meant, until he was old enough to compare it to how other people remembered things. Things he saw did not fade. Things he heard did not distort over time. He could close his eyes and reproduce the exact shape of a room he had walked through once, could recall the order and content of a conversation word for word weeks later, could look at a page of text and bring it back in full whenever he needed it. This was useful in obvious ways. It was also something he had learned, at a very young age, to be careful about letting people see. The value of a capability that no one knew you had was entirely different from the value of one that was known and accounted for. Once people understood that you remembered everything, they either became very careful around you, or they tried to use you as a recording tool. Neither outcome gave him the freedom he needed. By the 11th day, he had assembled enough pieces to begin comparing them. He did this at night, in the dark of his room, with his eyes closed and the complete stored images laid out in his mind, the way a person spread documents across a large table. He brought each observed section of Vorn's skin into focus. The forearm, the upper arm, the neck, the lower left wrist, that he had seen during a moment when Vorn removed a cuff to show a visitor something. The section of the right shoulder that had been briefly visible during an incident in the courtyard when Vorn pulled off his coat. He set them in spatial relation to each other, accounting for where on the body each section was, and began to look at them as a single document, rather than separate images. The marks were not all the same age. Some were older, faded into the skin to a pale gray that you would miss without careful attention. Others were darker and more recent, cut or burned in with more precision. They covered a significant portion of Vorn's upper body, in a pattern that, when viewed as a whole, resolved into something Cale had seen before. It was a route map. Not a drawing of one. Not a reproduction of a map made on paper and then transferred to skin. It was a working notation system, the kind used by people who moved through territory that could not be documented on paper, because paper could be found and read and used against you. The marks denoted locations, using a positional code. Their placement on the body corresponded to directional information, and their shape denoted what type of location they marked: a junction, a crossing point, a supply point, a boundary line. Cale understood this because he had, 3 years before being taken, spent 4 months in a building that housed the personal library of a merchant who dealt in geographical information. He had read every book in that library, twice in most cases, including 3 volumes on historical surveying notation systems, and a privately printed reference that described covert cartographic methods used by people who moved goods through territories where official routes were closed to them. The system on Vorn's skin matched one of those methods closely enough that there was no question about what it was. He lay in the dark and breathed slowly, and held the full assembled image steady in his mind. What he was looking at, across Vorn's body, was a complete map of the routes, outposts, supply points, and crossing locations of a network that spanned, at minimum, all of the Eastern Territories. Every slaver route, every holding point, every supply location where people could be moved, hidden, transferred, and redirected. Every crossing where movement could continue past one territory into another. The marks on Vorn's skin were, literally, the operational map of an empire built on the movement of people against their will. And the reason they were on his skin rather than on paper was so that no physical document could ever be seized, read, and used to bring the whole structure down. Vorn himself was the map. Cale lay very still for a long time after he arrived at that understanding. Then he went back through every section he had memorized and began to identify what he was missing: the chest, most of the back, the right forearm below the elbow. He had significant sections but not the complete picture, and a partial map could mislead as badly as no map at all. He needed to see the rest. This presented a practical problem. The sections he was missing were not ones he could observe casually during normal duties. They required either closer proximity than his current role allowed, or a different kind of situation. He spent the next 3 weeks becoming, from Vorn's perspective, furniture. He arrived first at every duty station. He completed his work without needing instruction. He corrected a mathematical error in the account books on his 14th day, reported it to the person overseeing the records without comment, and never mentioned it again. He helped Nora with a task that was not his assignment, on a day when she was working with an injury to her hand that she had not reported to anyone, and he did it without making it into anything beyond one person helping another. After 3 weeks, Vorn looked at him the way Vorn looked at the wall, without suspicion, without particular attention, and without any sense that something unexpected might be happening in that direction. That was when Cale began looking for the remaining sections in earnest. He found the opportunity he needed on a morning when Vorn's regular attendant, a man named Eli who had been assigned to Vorn's personal service for years, developed a fever that kept him from working. Cale was assigned as a replacement for the day, which meant access to Vorn's private rooms at a time of day when the careful visible presentation Vorn maintained throughout his working hours was not yet fully assembled. Cale did his work with complete efficiency, and zero appearance of interest in anything beyond the immediate task. In the process, he saw what he needed to see. The back, the chest, the lower right arm, all marked, all detailed, all stored with the same perfect accuracy as everything else he had ever seen and needed to keep. By the end of that morning, Cale had the complete map. All of it. Every route, every junction, every outpost marker, every supply point, every crossing location in the entire Eastern network. He had it in his mind with the clarity of a printed page, every symbol in its correct position, every section of the notation system reading as it was intended to read now that he had all the pieces. He went back to his regular duties that afternoon. He completed the evening correspondence without errors. And just before he closed his eyes to sleep, he went through the map one more time and stopped on a marking that had occupied a portion of his thinking since the moment he first saw it. It was on the left side of Vorn's lower back, positioned differently from everything else on the map. The symbol type did not match any of the outpost or route markers in the notation system. It was older than most of the other marks, faded almost to the point of invisibility, and it was positioned in a way that, within the notation system's directional logic, placed it beyond the eastern boundary of the entire network. Beyond the network, beyond all the routes and outposts and supply points, beyond the territory that Vorn and the people like him moved through and controlled. He had cross-referenced that directional location in his mind, against the geographical knowledge he had built from the library he spent 4 months in, and against everything else he had heard and read since then about the territories of the East. The symbol on Vorn's lower back, translated through the notation system and placed in its correct geographical position, pointed to a location that everyone in the Eastern Territories knew about, and almost no one ever went near. The Forest of Veilthorn. The Cursed Land. The territory that the stories said had been ruled, 300 years ago, by an Alpha King who had declared war on the slavers of his time and been cursed into an endless sleep. The forest that no slaver entered because the old king's edict, whether real or legend, had held through 3 centuries of fear. The place that appeared on no current trade map because the current networks had been built entirely around it. The location marked on Vorn's skin, older than everything else on him, was a crossing point, a way in. A hidden border into Veilthorn that someone, at some point in the past, had known about and marked, and never used. Because going through it meant going into the one territory where no one in the network had ever dared to follow. Cale lay in the dark and let the full weight of what he had found settle over him. He did not allow himself to feel hope immediately. He was careful with hope because it was an emotion, and emotions affected the quality of thinking. And right now the quality of his thinking was the most important asset he had. But he felt something that was the earliest, most structural form of certainty, the kind that comes not from wanting something to be true, but from looking at all the available evidence and finding that it consistently points in one direction. There was a way out of this system that no one in the system was watching, not because it was safe, because it was feared. And fear, Cale had decided long ago, was just a kind of information about what other people thought was dangerous. It was not a reliable map of what was actually dangerous. Those two things were sometimes the same, and sometimes very, very different. He was going to find out which one applied to Veilthorn. He was going to take as many people as would come with him. And he was going to find out what was on the other side of the only border that the most powerful slaver in the Eastern Territories had never crossed. The trade festival happened once a year, and Vorn announced it at the end of the spring records review, with the same tone a person used to announce a change in the supply schedule. His lieutenants wrote the date into their ledgers and showed nothing visible, because visible reactions signaled priorities beyond the work in front of you, and that was not something people in Vorn's organization advertised openly. Cale noted the date, noted the details of what the festival involved, and began, very quietly, to build the framework of the thing he had been moving toward since the 11th night in this compound. He had been here for 4 months. In those 4 months, he had identified 9 other people in the compound who were not here by choice, and who had something in their behavior that told him they were still paying attention to the idea of somewhere else. Not all 9 were people he could bring with him. Some had been here too long, and the calculation they had made about the cost of hope had become permanent. He respected those calculations without agreeing with them. He was not going to ask anyone to leave who did not want to. But there were 4 who were different. Owen was 20 years old, brought in 8 months ago, assigned to the exterior work crew. He had an old injury to his shoulder from the transfer that had healed at a bad angle, and he moved with a slight restriction that he compensated for so naturally that most people never noticed it. What Cale noticed was that Owen was the only person on the exterior crew who always knew exactly what the guards were doing without appearing to look at them. He was watching the patterns the way Cale watched patterns, which meant he was thinking about something specific, and had been for a while. Beth was assigned to the kitchens. She was older, somewhere in her middle 30s, with a steadiness about her that came not from resignation, but from a much longer practice of patience than Cale had managed to build. She had been in 3 different facilities before this one, which he had pieced together from fragments of conversation she had with Nora in the East Corridor. She was the only person in the kitchen who never wasted motion. She measured everything she did. She was a person who had been planning something for a very long time, and had simply not yet found the right conditions. Cole was 18. He had arrived 2 months after Cale, purchased for the same kinds of records work, and he had made one mistake in his first week that had cost him significantly. He had not made another. He had also memorized the guard roster on the compound exterior within his first 3 weeks, which he had no assigned reason to do. He was doing it for the same reason Cale would have done it. Gwen was the one Cale was least certain about. She was quiet in a way that was hard to read, somewhere between the quietness of someone who had given up and the quietness of someone who was conserving themselves for something. But twice in the past month he had seen her at an east-facing window during the evening hours, looking at the space between the inner and outer walls with a specific kind of attention that told him her mind was working on something geometrical and spatial. She was measuring a gap. He approached each of them in a way suited to who they were. He did not explain anything in a way that could be overheard or misunderstood. He created small, practical reasons to be near each of them, and in the course of those interactions he said enough that a careful person would understand, and a careless person would miss entirely. Owen understood within the first 2 exchanges. He did not say anything in response. He simply looked at Cale for a moment longer than necessary, and then returned to his work, which was the only answer Cale needed. Beth took longer, not because she was slow to understand, but because she was not a person who committed to anything without being satisfied that what she was committing to was real and not merely hopeful. Cale answered her unspoken question by describing the route he had in his mind, section by section, in a 4-minute window, when they were alone in a storage corridor. He drew nothing. He spoke with the kind of precision that was either proof of a real plan or proof of something else entirely. Beth looked at him for a long time when he finished. "When?" she said. "The festival," Cale said. She nodded once and left without another word. Cole needed no persuasion. When Cale found the right moment to speak to him, Cole already understood enough from 2 months of watching Cale to simply ask one question. "How many of us?" he said. "As many as will go," Cale said. "I know 3 others who might," Cole said. Cale thought about it. More people meant more variables, but more people also meant that what they were doing had a different weight to it, something closer to a statement than an escape. "Tell them the festival date," he said. "Nothing more yet." Gwen was the last. He found her at the east window during an evening when the corridor behind her was empty. He stood beside her and looked at the same wall she was looking at. "The gap between the drainage outlet and the guard post is wider, at the 4th hour past midnight," he said quietly. "The guard on the north rotation is also covering the south section by then, because the rotation runs short-handed at that hour. There are approximately 8 minutes in the gap." Gwen looked at him. "The festival will run long this year," Cale said. "It always does when the buyers from the western cities are invited, and I have seen Vorn's guest list." Gwen was quiet. Then, "I have a bad knee." "I know," Cale said. "We will not be running the entire way." She turned back to the window. After a pause, "All right," she said. The festival was 41 days away when he had that final conversation. He used those 41 days to complete every preparation he could, without being seen, to prepare anything. He confirmed the drainage outlet dimensions during a legitimate maintenance task. He verified the guard roster changes during the festival from an overheard conversation between 2 compound supervisors, discussing the scheduling problem the festival always created. He identified the additional people Cole had mentioned, assessed them as best he could from a distance, concluded that 2 were reliable and 1 was not, and narrowed the group to 7 total. He memorized the route from the compound to the Valethorn border in 4 stages, building each stage from the complete map in his mind and the geographical knowledge he had accumulated over years, and he ran the entire route through his memory every night, checking for gaps, adjusting for what he did not know for certain, building contingencies for the variables he could not fully predict. He did not sleep much in those 41 days. He needed to be ready, and being ready required thinking, and thinking required every available minute. The night of the festival arrived on a clear evening with no wind, which was the best possible kind of night for moving quietly across open ground. Vorn's compound transformed from its usual controlled quiet into something louder, and more occupied as the afternoon progressed. Buyers and their assistants arrived in stages, and by the time the evening bells rang, the main hall was full of voices and the kind of distracted energy that pulled every guard and handler toward the visible, occupied parts of the building. The people who were not part of the celebration were expected to be in their rooms by the third bell of the evening. That was fine. The third bell was exactly when Cale needed everyone to be exactly where they were supposed to be. He moved at the third bell plus 40 minutes, not before, because before was when people were still settling into their assigned locations and transitions created observation, not after, because after was when the first check of the evening was conducted. He moved through the east wing corridor, with cloth wrapped around his shoes, to reduce sound and the full layout of the building in his mind, updated from 4 months of careful observation. He stopped at 4 doors. He did not knock. The people behind those doors were already awake and waiting, because he had told them, in the course of the past 6 days, the exact time and exact sequence. Owen came out of his door, already carrying his boots rather than wearing them. Beth had a small cloth bundle she had assembled piece by piece over the past 2 weeks, gathering items that were practical and light, and that she had obtained without taking anything that would be noticed as missing before morning. Cole was already in the corridor before Cale reached his door. Gwen moved carefully, but steadily, on her bad knee without complaint. The other two, Finn and a young woman named Lena, came from the north meeting point Cole had organized. 7 people, moving quietly through a building where all the attention was directed elsewhere. The drainage outlet was exactly where Cale had confirmed it to be, and the gap beside it was exactly as wide as he had measured. They went through one at a time, which was slow, but single file through a gap left no question of who went first, and no confusion about spacing, and confusion in a moment like that cost time that could not be recovered. The space between the inner and outer walls was dark, and took 45 seconds to cross. The outer gate's latch was the style Cale had identified on his first night. It took him 22 seconds. They walked through the gate and into the dark of the road beyond the compound wall, and behind them, the festival noise from inside continued without interruption. Cale did not allow himself to feel anything about that. There would be time for feeling things later. Right now there was a road going north, a river crossing 2 hours ahead, and a decision about which direction to take after that, which would determine everything. "Which way?" Owen said quietly. Cale looked east into the dark. "That way," he said. He started walking before anyone could ask why east was the choice, and before anyone could point out that east led toward territory that no person of good judgment voluntarily entered. He knew that. He also knew that the only people who never went into Valethorn were the people who had built the network that had brought all 7 of them to Vorn's compound. And that was exactly why east was the only answer that mattered. For 3 days they moved through open land, flat ground and dry grass, and the occasional line of trees marking where a waterway ran below the surface, and open sky above them that made Cale aware, every hour, of how visible they were. He kept them moving at night, and resting during the brightest hours of the day, using the cover of terrain where he could find it, and relying on speed and distance where he could not. No one complained. This surprised him, though he did not show it. He had expected friction, some moment in the first day or two when someone decided the open land and the cold nights, and the uncertainty of what they were walking toward, was more than they had agreed to. But the 7 of them moved with a collective quiet purpose that felt less like agreement and more like a shared understanding of what the alternative was. Finn had a blister on his right heel by the end of the first day. He wrapped it with a strip from the hem of his shirt and kept walking. Lena had said little since they left the compound, but she kept pace, and her eyes were always scanning the ground ahead, looking for the same things Cale was looking for. She had useful instincts, and she used them quietly. On the 4th day, Vorn's pursuit would begin. Cale knew this from everything discussed in Vorn's compound, about the procedures followed when someone left without permission. The morning check came at the 6th bell. If the discrepancy was found and reported within the first hour, a pursuit team could be organized and moving by midday. Pursuit teams from Vorn's operation moved fast, with horses and knowledge of the eastern roads. They also, as far as Cale knew from 4 months of observation, never followed anyone into Valethorn territory. The closest they came was the boundary that, according to the notation on Vorn's skin, was marked by a crossing point that no member of the network had used in at least the time it had taken for the mark to fade to near invisibility, on aging skin. The forest appeared on the horizon of the fifth day. It appeared first as a darkening at the edge of the world, before it appeared as trees. First a line of deeper color against the sky, heavier than the color of the plain. Then, as they walked through the sixth morning, a mass that resolved into something taller and denser than anything else on this flat eastern plain. By midday it stood before them, a wall of old growth so dense that the light stopped at the edge of it, as clearly as if someone had drawn a line in the air. Lena stopped walking. "That is it," she said, not a question. "Yes," Cale said. She looked at it for a long moment. "People say no one who goes in comes back. People also say that because no one in the slaving network goes in," Cale said. "That is not the same thing as no one coming back. It is a story that serves the people who need everyone to stay away from territory they cannot operate in." "You are sure about that difference?" Finn said. "No," Cale said, "but I am sure about the alternative." A silence. Then Owen said, "I would rather take the forest." They entered at dusk. The change happened immediately. Outside the tree line, the evening was cool and open. Inside it, the temperature dropped, and the sound of the wind cut off, and the quality of the light changed to something older and dimmer, as if the trees were not simply blocking the sun, but absorbing it. The ground was covered in roots and dead leaves, and something softer beneath that deadened every footstep. No one spoke much after the first hour. The forest had a quality that made conversation feel unnecessary and slightly wrong, like speaking at full volume, in a place where silence was the correct response to whatever was present there. It was not hostile. It was more like stepping into something with its own rules that had been in place for a very long time. Cale navigated from the map in his mind. The crossing point, marked on Vorn's skin, was not an arbitrary location. It had been chosen by someone who knew this territory, which meant it corresponded to something real, a navigable path that had once been used. He could not know from the mark alone what that path looked like on the ground, but he could orient himself, using the directional logic of the notation system, and follow where it pointed. He was 2 degrees off on the second day, which he corrected by reading the position of what light filtered through the canopy above. He was 3 degrees the other direction on the third day, which he corrected by the slope of the ground beneath them. Water always ran downhill, and the way the terrain angled told him where the underlying structure pointed. On the evening of the third day in the forest, Lena sat down and did not get up. Cale crouched beside her. She was not injured. She was not sick. She sat with her knees drawn up and looked at the darkness between the trees ahead, with the expression of someone who had reached the end of a calculation they had been working through for days. "I cannot keep going into something I cannot see the end of," she said. "I thought I could. I cannot." Cole started to say something. Cale put one hand up briefly, and Cole stopped. "You can go back," Cale said. Lena looked at him. "We are 3 days in." "Then 3 days back to the edge," Cale said. "And from the edge, north takes you along the boundary, into territory that is not part of Vorn's primary network. You would need to move carefully, but it is possible." She looked at him for a long moment, weighing something she already knew the answer to, but needed to feel the weight of before she could accept it. "I am sorry," she said. "There is nothing to apologize for," Cale said. He meant it. A young man named Ren, one of the 2 Cole had brought into the group, chose to go with her. He had said almost nothing since the first night, and Cale had seen him watching the trees with the expression of someone whose courage had run out, not through weakness, but through an honest assessment of what he was and was not able to do. That kind of honesty deserved the same respect as any other. Cale watched them go until they were out of sight. Then he turned back to the remaining 5. "5 more days," he said. "Perhaps 6. Keep moving." No one argued. On the 4th night in the forest, something followed them. It was not close enough to see, and not loud enough to identify with certainty. It was a presence at the edge of hearing, a movement that paralleled their movement, paused when they paused, adjusted its angle when they changed direction. It was not the focused tracking of something narrowing a distance toward a target. It felt more like observation. Owen came up beside Cale on the 2nd hour of hearing it. "Something is out there," he said quietly. "I know," Cale said. "What is it?" "I do not know," Cale said, "but it has not moved closer in 2 hours. That tells us something." "What does it tell us?" Owen said. Cale considered the question honestly. That whatever it is watching, rather than hunting. Those are different things. Owen looked at the dark between the trees. Are you certain about that? No, Cale said. Keep moving. The presence did not close in. By morning it was gone, or at least no longer audible. Cale had not slept during the night it was present. He had sat with his back against a tree, with his eyes open, and his mind moving through everything he had ever read about Valethorn, which was not very much, but was more than nothing. The castle appeared on the 7th day. It appeared first as a shape that should not have been there, a vertical mass in the middle of ancient trees that was too regular and too intentional to be natural. Then, as they pushed through the growth toward it, it became walls, then towers, then the full size of a structure that was large enough to be a fortress and old enough to be built of stone that no one worked with anymore, dark and dense and covered in decades of root growth and ivy so complete that in certain lights the whole structure looked like part of the forest. Beth stopped and looked up at it for a long moment. There is a castle in the middle of a cursed forest, she said. Yes, Cale said. Of course there is, she said, and kept walking. The main entrance had been sealed by root growth so thick and old that clearing it would have taken hours and tools they did not have. Cale found a secondary entrance on the north face, where the growth had separated from the stone along one edge, leaving a gap wide enough to pass through one at a time. He went first. Inside, the cold was immediate and structural, not the natural cold of stone in a forest but something deeper, as if the temperature had been held at a specific point, deliberately for a very long time. The air was dry and completely still. The dust on the floors had settled in patterns that had not been disturbed in years. The halls were intact. The architecture was old and deliberate, made for permanence, in a way that current construction rarely attempted. High ceilings with carved beams still in place. Staircases of stone that had not shifted or cracked. Rooms that were empty but not destroyed, which meant the castle had not simply been abandoned, it had been preserved. Owen moved through the first corridor with his hand trailing along the wall. It is not falling apart, he said. No, Cale said. Why is it not falling apart? Cale had no concise answer for that, so he said nothing, and kept moving. He was looking for the lower level, and he was looking for it because of the marking on Vorn's skin that he had been turning over in his mind since the day he first identified it. The symbol that did not match the outpost or route notation. The symbol for something sealed. He found the entrance to the lower level, behind a large stone piece that had been moved at some point and never returned to its original position. A staircase descended at an angle that made it clear it was going significantly below the main floor. Cole looked at the staircase. Are we going down there? He said. Yes, Cale said. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, after you then. The staircase opened into a corridor wider than the one above and lined with the same dark stone. The cold here was more pronounced. At the end of the corridor was a door. Cale stood before it and read the warnings carved into the stone on either side. 3 languages. 2 of them he knew. The third he could work through with effort. The warnings were consistent across all 3. Do not enter. Do not disturb what is sealed here. Do not allow an unbonded Omega to come within range of this chamber. The language used made clear that the person who wrote these warnings had believed them without question. Owen read the first 2 and looked at Cale. This says specifically that we should not be here, he said. It says an unbonded Omega should not be here, Cale said. You are an unbonded Omega, Owen said. Yes, Cale said. Owen was quiet for a moment. You are going to open it anyway, he said. Cale looked at the door. He had spent 4 months building toward this moment. The question he had returned to most consistently was not whether to open a sealed door in a cursed location, but why this door in this location was the safest option available to people who had run out of other directions to go. He had answered that question months ago. He placed his palm flat against the door. The stone was not cold. It was exactly the same temperature as his hand, which made no sense given the air in the corridor. He pressed. Under his palm, as if it had been waiting for something exactly this specific for a very long time without losing patience, the seal along the door's edge fractured in a single clean line from top to bottom. The sound was not loud. One clear note, like a bell struck once, and then the silence came back, but it was a different silence than before. The door swung open on its own. The room beyond was lit by something with no visible source, a pale and steady light that came from everywhere at once and illuminated a circular chamber that was large and bare, except for the thing at its center. A stone surface, a figure on it, motionless, still, armored in something that belonged to no era Cale had ever read about, old and elaborate, and completely unmarked by 3 centuries of time. Dark hair, a face that looked, impossibly, like the face of someone sleeping and breathing. The chest of the figure rose and fell in a rhythm so slow that Cale watched for several seconds before he was certain he had seen it. He stepped into the room. The breathing changed. The light in the chamber shifted when Cale crossed the threshold. It did not pulse or flare. It simply adjusted, the way light adjusted when someone opened a window in a room that had been closed too long, a redistribution rather than an increase. The figure on the stone surface did not move, but the rhythm of the breathing changed, deepening, then slowing further, then speeding again, in the pattern of someone moving through the final layers of a very deep sleep toward the surface of waking. Cale stood still. Behind him in the corridor, he could hear Owen and Beth and Cole and Gwen doing the same. No one spoke. The change in the breathing lasted approximately 40 seconds. Then it settled into something that was clearly not the rhythm of sleep anymore. And then the man on the stone opened his eyes. The eyes were very dark, so deep a shade that the distinction between dark brown and black barely mattered in the room's pale light. They focused on the ceiling first, held there, then they moved. They found Cale. They stayed on Cale. The silence in the chamber stretched. Then the man on the stone moved, and the movement was not the slow, disoriented motion of someone waking in a normal way. He sat up in one deliberate motion, and the armor he wore shifted and resettled with a sound that filled the quiet space completely. He looked at his own hands. He turned them over. He looked at the fractured seal visible through the open door behind Cale. He looked back at Cale. When he spoke, his voice was what happened to a voice that had not been used in 3 centuries, but was still, despite that, entirely present. It had the quality of something very old that had not diminished with age. "How long?" he said. Cale answered him honestly. 300 years, he said, approximately. The man, who Cale now understood completely, was Rael Veilthorn, the Alpha King, the stories described as cursed and gone and never returning, was quiet for a moment. 300 years, Rael said, not questioning, weighing. The way someone weighed something they had feared was true, and now had confirmed. "Yes," Cale said. Rael looked around the chamber, at the door, at the people visible in the corridor beyond it, at Cale again. "You opened the seal," he said. "Yes," Cale said. "You read the warnings." "Yes," Cale said. Something in Rael's expression moved. Not surprise, more like a kind of recognition. "And you opened it anyway." "There was no better option available," Cale said. "And I believe the warnings were protective, rather than prescriptive." A pause. "Protective," Rael repeated. "They were written to keep people away from you," Cale said, "not to protect people from you. The language used is preservation language, not danger language. I have read enough of both to know the difference." Rael looked at him for a long moment with those very dark eyes. "And if you had been wrong about that distinction," he said. "Then I would have been wrong," Cale said. "But I was not." Something happened in Rael's expression then that was harder to name. Not the first expression of a man reassessing his situation. The expression of a man who had been asleep for 300 years and was encountering, in the first moments of waking, something he had not anticipated. A person who answered questions the way Cale answered them. He stood. Standing, Rael was very tall. The armor added to that impression. He was also still in the process of reorienting, because he put one hand briefly on the edge of the stone surface to steady himself, not with the unsteadiness of weakness, but with the deliberateness of someone recalibrating their relationship with the physical world, after a very long absence from it. Gwen made a quiet sound from the corridor. Cale did not look back. "You should all come in," Rael said. His voice had steadied. "The corridor will not hold all of you comfortably," Beth said, from the doorway. "He knows we are here." "He has been awake for 4 minutes," Cale said. He was paying attention before he spoke. Rael glanced briefly toward the sound of Beth's voice. "Your companion is correct," he said. Come in. I will not harm you. You have my word, which is not a small thing regardless of what state the world is in at the moment. They came in, one by one. Owen first, Beth second, Cole third, carrying the look of a person who had decided the events of the past 6 days had exhausted his capacity for surprise. Gwen last, still careful with her knee. The 5 of them stood in the chamber with the man who had been sealed inside it for 3 centuries, and no one said anything for a moment. Then Rael looked at Cale and said, "Tell me what I need to know." Cale said, "All of it," Rael said. "Start with what is most urgent." Cale thought about urgency for a moment. "Vorn's pursuit team is likely 2 days behind us," Cale said. "They will stop at the forest's edge, because they always stop at the forest's edge. But they will know the direction we came from, which means they will know someone entered Valethorn. That information will reach Vorn within a week." Rael was still. "Vorn is the largest operator in the Eastern Slaving Network," Cale continued. "He runs 17 outpost locations and 4 central processing hubs. He operates through a system of paid enforcement and the particular kind of fear that comes from 3 decades of consistent consequences. The network has been in place for at least 30 years in its current form." "Who is Vorn?" Rael said. "The man who purchased me," Cale said. A pause. "He purchased you?" "Yes." Rael looked at him steadily. "And the others with you?" "Different buyers. Different points in the same system," Cale said. "All 5 of us came from Vorn's compound directly." Something changed in the quality of the stillness around Rael. His expression did not alter in any visible way, but the air in the room shifted, the way the air shifted in the moment before weather that had been building finally broke. "How large is this network?" Rael said. His voice was level, but the question had weight behind it. "In the Eastern Territories, across Vorn's operation alone, several hundred people are currently being held," Cale said. "Across the full connected network, the number is larger, based on what I observed in 4 months, and the scale of the infrastructure the map indicates. The number is significant." "What map?" Rael said. Cale told him about the marks on Vorn's skin. He described the notation system, the completeness of the information, the location of every outpost and crossing point he had memorized and carried since the day he saw the final pieces. He spoke clearly and without editorializing, because the information itself was enough. When he finished, Rael was quiet. He was looking at a point slightly past Cale's left shoulder, his expression the expression of someone processing a large amount of information, very rapidly and very efficiently. "You memorized a map of the entire Eastern Slaving Network from marks on a man's skin," Rael said finally. "Yes," Cale said. "And you have it all right now, in your memory." "Yes," Cale said. "And you are certain it is accurate?" "The portions I was able to verify against other sources match," Cale said. "The route we took from Asveth to this forest matched the notation exactly. The boundary marker for Valethorn was in the position the map indicated. The gap in the external guard rotation at Vorn's compound matched the outpost management pattern the notation indicated for facilities of that size. Nothing has contradicted it." Rael looked at him for a very long time. "Who are you?" Rael said. It was not a question Cale had been asked in a meaningful way in a long time, and the directness of it in this particular context made him still for just a moment before he answered. "My name is Cale," he said. "I was taken 2 years ago. I was purchased by Vorn 4 months ago, and I walked into this forest because the map on Vorn's skin showed a border crossing that no one in his network would follow me through." Rael was quiet. "You walked into the cursed forest," Rael said slowly, "because the slavers would not follow you here." "Yes," Cale said. "That is," Rael said, "one of the most precisely calculated acts of courage I have heard described in a very long time." Cale did not respond to that. He was not sure what to say to it, and saying nothing was almost always more accurate than saying something incorrect. "Sit down," Rael said. "All of you. This is going to take some time." They sat. And Rael Valethorn, who had been asleep for 300 years, and was now awake in a world that had been rebuilt entirely in his absence, listened to everything that had happened while he was gone. He listened without interrupting. He asked questions only when something required clarification, and his questions were always precise. He received each piece of information the way someone received pieces of a structure they were assembling, placing each one in relation to the others, and building the picture as it came. When they were done, the pale light of the chamber had not changed, because it was not light that followed the sun. But outside the castle walls, somewhere beyond the layers of stone and root growth, and 300 years of waiting, the forest of Valethorn was doing what it had always done. It was holding the line, and inside it, for the first time in 3 centuries, something else was holding the line too. The castle around them breathed in the dark, and the sealed chamber that had kept a king and his people waiting for the right person to walk through an open door was sealed no longer, and the border that no one in the network had ever crossed had been crossed at last, and everything that came next had already begun. Rael spent the next 3 days learning. He was not a man who needed things explained twice, and he was not a man who responded to difficult information with the kind of emotional disorganization that made conversations slow. He listened. He asked precise questions when something needed clarification. He absorbed each new piece of information with the focused attention of someone who understood that every detail was part of a larger picture he was assembling with care. Chaol sat across from him for most of those 3 days and answered every question he was asked. The others helped with what they knew, which in some cases filled in details that Chaol's observations from inside Vorn's compound had not covered, angles on the broader world that came from their different histories and different experiences of the same broken system. The castle, Chaol had discovered by the second day, was not as empty as it initially appeared. The rooms on the main level were empty, but the deeper levels, past the sealed chamber, held something none of them had expected. The chambers that a military structure of this size and age would have for quartering a significant number of people were not empty. They were occupied, not by living people in the ordinary sense, by people in the same state Rael had been in when they found him. The long, suspended sleep of the curse, preserved in alcoves along the walls of the lower corridor, in numbers that, when Chaol walked the full length of it and counted, reached 347. Rael's people. Not soldiers only. Some were, but the composition was broader. The people who had been part of Valethorn when Rael's war against the slavers of his time began, who had chosen to sleep alongside their king, rather than face a world that had cursed him, who had committed to waiting for whatever came next. Rael stood in the corridor and looked at them for a long time on the second morning. "They chose this," he said. "I did not order it." "I know," Chaol said. He did not know this as fact, but it matched everything he had observed about Rael in 2 days, and he was confident enough in those observations to say it. Rael looked at him. "You do not know," he said. "But you are right." They were quiet for a moment. "Can you wake them?" Chaol said. "The seal breaking was the condition," Rael said. "They will wake on their own now. It will take a few days." "We have time," Chaol said. Rael turned to look at him. "Do we?" "Vorn's pursuit team stopped at the forest edge," Chaol said. "I confirmed that this morning. I went back to the tree line and read the ground. They came in from the north, found the entry point, and left again going north. They are carrying the report back rather than waiting. Vorn will receive the information that someone entered Valethorn within a week, as I told you. His response to that information will tell us how much time we have." Rael looked at him. "You went back to the tree line," he said. "To confirm," Chaol said. "Alone?" "Yes." "Without telling anyone," Rael said. "It was a reconnaissance," Chaol said. "Not a group activity. I was back in 4 hours. I did not want to spend time on a conversation about whether it was necessary, when it was clearly necessary." Rael was quiet for a moment. Then something moved in his expression, not irritation and not concern, something that lived in the space between the practical and the personal, moving quietly toward one end of that space without hurrying. "In the future," Rael said, "tell me." "All right," Chaol said. The word was not a command. It was not the kind of sentence someone said in a relationship where commands were the primary mode of communication. It was the kind of sentence someone said when they had thought about it and decided, on balance, that they preferred knowing. It was a preference stated as a request, and Chaol recognized the distinction. By the end of the 3rd day, Rael had understood enough about the current state of the world to move to the next stage. He asked Chaol to reproduce the complete map from his memory onto paper, not a copy of the marks themselves, but a verbal account of the notation, translated into a format that the people who would need to use it could read without knowing the original notation system. This took most of a morning. Chaol spoke methodically and without pause, from the first outpost marker on the northern edge of the eastern network to the last crossing point in the south. Rail drew, not with tentative approximations, but with precise lines. The work of someone who had done this kind of thing before, and understood that precision was the difference between intelligence that was useful and intelligence that led people to the wrong places. When it was done, Rail looked at the paper for a long time. "All of this," he said, "from marks on a man's skin." "Yes," Cale said. "You could have used this information to run," Rail said, "to find somewhere safe." Cale thought about how to answer that. There was nowhere safe enough that this network could not eventually reach, he said. The map shows the range of it. Running would have been choosing a longer version of the same outcome. Rail looked at him. "So you came here?" "I came to the only border they would not cross," Cale said. "What was on the other side I did not know, but I knew it was outside their range." "And you found a sleeping king," Rail said. "And I found a sleeping king," Cale said. The expression that crossed Rail's face in the moment after that sentence was too brief and too complicated to fully analyze, but Cale stored it anyway, the way he stored everything, completely, and without deciding in advance what it meant. In the lower corridor, 347 people were beginning to wake. The process was quieter than Cale had expected. He had imagined, without articulating the expectation even to himself, that so many people waking from a centuries-long sleep would produce something dramatic. What it produced instead was something closer to a tide, a gradual filling of the castle's lower levels with people who woke methodically and oriented themselves with a quiet efficiency that spoke to the kind of people they had been before the sleep took them. Soldiers, but not only soldiers. There were builders among them, and people who had worked with land and water, and people whose skills were in organization and logistics and the management of large groups, women and men in roughly equal numbers, people who looked to be in their 20s, and people who looked to be in their 50s, all preserved at exactly the age they had been when they lay down. They looked at the castle's current state, and they looked at Rail, and they looked at the 5 people from the outside who had come with him, and they did not ask many questions. They asked the relevant ones. How long? What has changed? What happens next? Rail answered all 3. He answered the third one with the map. He laid it on the floor of the main hall, gathered the people who needed to see it, and spoke about it with the clarity of someone who had been processing information and forming plans for 4 days, and was now ready to present what he had arrived at. The plan was not complicated, because complicated plans failed when they depended on too many things being true simultaneously. In any operation covering multiple locations, the number of variables that could shift was too large to accommodate complexity. Rail had built a simple plan. Simultaneous action at every location on the map, coordinated through timing rather than through active communication, so that no single failure at one point could alert the other points before the action reached them. Every outpost, every hub, at the same hour, on the same night. A woman named Claire, who had woken on the second day, and immediately taken on the role of organizing the people waking around her, looked at the map for a long time and said, "The timing requires coordination over a very large distance. We do not have communication that covers the full range of the network." "We do not need communication," Rail said. "We need synchronization. That is a different thing." He looked at Cale. Cale stepped forward. "The outpost locations on the northern segment are 3 to 4 hours from each other on horseback," he said. "The southern segment has more concentration. If the action begins at the southernmost point at the 3rd hour after midnight, and the start signal is calibrated to account for travel time from the castle to each location, every point on the network can be reached within a 1-hour window of the target time." Claire looked at him steadily. "You worked this out already?" 3 nights ago, Cale said, while Rail was working with the people waking in the lower corridor. "I had time." A short silence. Then Claire looked at Rail with the expression of someone arriving at a conclusion. "Where did you find him?" she said. "He found me," Rail said. The days that followed were the most active Cale had experienced since leaving Vorn's compound. The castle, which had been still for 3 centuries, became something entirely different. A working base, running on the energy of people who were awake and preparing for something they had been waiting a very long time to do. Owen had taken to working alongside the former soldiers with a natural ease. Beth had placed herself in the organization of provisions and was moving through that work at a pace that made it clear She had found something that matched the particular quality of her competence precisely. Cole was working with a group of people on the written communications that would need to go out as part of the coordination plan. Gwen was, quietly and without announcement, building a signal system in the east courtyard, using reflected light and timed intervals. Cale moved between all of them, checking details, answering questions, providing the specific pieces of the map that each group needed. The map was entirely in his mind, which made him the reference for every question of accuracy. Rael found him on the fifth night, in the room that had become Cale's working space, covered in large sheets of paper, with handwritten reproductions of map sections. He was not wearing the armor. Without it, he looked more like someone who existed in the present. "You have not slept," Rael said. "Not much," Cale said. "When did you last sleep properly?" "2 nights ago," Cale said. "For a few hours." Rael pulled the other chair toward the table and sat down. "Tell me something that is not about the plan," he said. Cale looked at him. "What would you like to know?" "Where were you before Vorn's compound?" 3 other facilities, Cale said. "Over 2 years." "And before that?" "A city in the northern region," Cale said. "I had a position working for a merchant who dealt in geographical texts. I was there for about 4 months." "How old are you?" Rael said. 17, Cale said. Rael was quiet for a moment. "I was on my own from 14, Cale said. "Not as a complaint. As a fact." "How long have you been able to remember the way you remember?" Rael said. The question was more precise than it appeared. Not when Cale had learned to read, when he had understood that his memory was not what other people's memories were. "I was about 10 when I understood it was different," Cale said. "Before that I assumed everyone remembered the same way." "What did you do when you understood it was not the same?" "I stopped talking about it," Cale said. Rael looked at him steadily. "A logical response," he said. "It seemed like the safest one," Cale said. They were quiet for a moment. The castle around them was quieter at this hour, and the only sounds were the distant sounds of the forest outside the walls and the small, consistent sound of the lamp. "Your name is Cale," Rael said. "Yes," Cale said. "Just Cale?" "I have not had a second name in a long time," Cale said. It stopped being useful. Something moved in Rael's expression. "I would like to give you one," he said. "After this is done, if that is something you would accept." Cale looked at him. It was a simple statement, not ambiguous. Rael said things directly because anything less was a form of dishonesty he found less efficient than the alternative. "Ask me again when it is done," Cale said. "I will," Rael said. And then, in the same direct tone, "Sleep now. The plan will still be accurate in the morning." Cale looked at the papers on the table. "The plan needs you functional," Rael said. "Sleep." It was not an order, it was a statement of practical truth that was also, in some way Cale was too tired to fully analyze, something else, something that lived in the territory between the practical and the personal. Cale set down his pen. He slept. The night that Vorn's people came into the forest dealt with them. Cale did not witness this directly. He was in the castle when it happened, and what he knew of it came from what he observed the following morning. He went to the northern tree line at first light and read the ground with the same careful attention he applied to everything. 6 sets of tracks coming in from the north side in the deep hours of the night, moving in a formation that indicated they had been sent with a specific objective and with the expectation of returning. The tracks went into the forest. They did not come back out. He came back to the castle and reported to Rael. 6, he said. Rael nodded. They would not have gone in without being sent, Cale said. Which means Vorn has reached a point of decision. He knows something changed inside Veilthorn. He is more unsettled by this than he has been by anything in the Eastern Territories for a very long time. That changes how he will act. He knows something changed, Rael said. Yes, Cale said. The question is what he does with that knowledge. They agreed on the most likely answer that same morning, after a conversation with Claire and 2 of the strategic planners who had woken in the first days. Vorn would tighten the network, concentrate resources at the hubs, prepare for an unknown threat from an unexpected direction. He would not strike first, because he did not know what to strike at, but he would make the network harder to move against. We move in 4 days, Rael said. Not 5. 4 days, Claire confirmed. They moved in 4. The passage of 347 people through the forest was not the slow, uncertain journey Cale had made on the way in. Rael knew this forest in the way that he knew his own hands. He had grown up in it, and ruled from within it, and understood its geography with the kind of knowledge that was built into a person, rather than learned from a reference. He moved at the front of the column at a pace that covered ground quickly and quietly, and the forest around them was cooperative in a way that Cale noticed, and filed without finding an easy explanation for. They emerged from the western edge at dusk, and split into the coordinated groups Claire had organized. Each group took a different direction, toward a different section of the network. Each carried the timing sequence and route information, drawn from the map that lived in Cale's memory, and had been transferred to paper by Rael's precise hand. Cale stayed with Rael. Not because Rael had asked. Because the section of the plan centered on Vorn's main compound required the most detailed knowledge of the layout, the guard rotations, and the specific internal structure of the facility. Cale had that knowledge. No one else did. They reached the compound in the deep hours of the night. It looked exactly as Cale had left it. Same wall, same gate, same guard, with the habit of looking left before right. The lamp in Vorn's study was on, which meant Vorn was not sleeping well, which meant the reports from the forest had done exactly what Cale had expected them to do. The side entrance, Cale said quietly. Rael looked at the position Cale indicated. How long will the rotation leave it unattended? 8 minutes, starting now, Cale said. 8 is enough, Rael said. It was more than enough. The compound's guards were positioned on a system designed for one specific threat: people escaping outward, not people entering from outside. It was the design failure of someone who had operated for so long without meaningful external opposition that the idea of that kind of opposition had not received the attention it deserved. Rael's people moved through the compound with the efficiency of people who had done this kind of work before, in a different century with different specific circumstances, but the same essential components. The guards were removed from their posts without injury, which Rael had specified, and which his people delivered precisely. The people in the compound who were not there by choice were the priority, and identifying them was something Cale had already handled by knowing, from 4 months of observation, exactly who was where. Cale walked through the East Wing corridor with Rael beside him, and knocked on the doors he knew. Nora opened her door before he finished the knock. She looked at him. She looked at Rael. She looked at Cale again. "You came back," she said. "Yes," Cale said. She looked at him for a moment longer. "The others in the facility?" "All of them," Cale said. She nodded once, and moved immediately, without another word, which was the most efficient possible response, and Cale found that he had expected exactly this from her. Vorn's study was on the upper level. The lamp there was still burning. The door was unlocked because Vorn was inside, and a person who locks a door from the inside announces their awareness, and Vorn did not yet know he had anything to be aware of. Ross, Vorn's most senior lieutenant, was in the corridor outside the study door when they came up the stairs. Ross was a large man who had spent years being the kind of obstacle that discouraged further movement. He looked at Cale, and then he looked at Rael, and then he looked at what was behind Rael in the stairway, and made a decision. It was the wrong decision. What followed was fast, and resulted in Ross sitting with his back against the corridor wall, unhurt but very still, with the kind of stillness that came from a rapid and thorough reassessment of the available options. Rael opened the study door. Vorn was at his desk. He looked up. He looked at the doorway. He looked at what was standing in it. Cale stepped forward so that he was visible. Something complicated moved across Vorn's face, and then was controlled, but it arrived at controlled a half-second too late, which told Cale everything he needed to know about Vorn's internal state in this moment. "You," Vorn said. "Yes," Cale said. Vorn looked at Rael. His eyes moved from the armor, to the face, to the particular quality of the stillness Rael maintained, which was not the stillness of someone exercising patience, but the stillness of someone who no longer needed to demonstrate anything to anyone. "Who is this?" Vorn said, not a question. Cale told him. Vorn was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Cale again. "You went into Valethorn," he said. "Yes," Cale said. "And you found him?" "Yes," Cale said. Vorn looked at his desk, at the papers on it, the route documents and correspondence, then back at Cale. How much do you know? Vorn said. All of it, Kale said. Every route, every outpost, every hub, every crossing. The full notation system from the map on your skin. Vorn's expression changed. It changed in the specific way that the expression of someone who believed they had built something permanent changed when they understood, in one moment, that the permanence they had counted on was not real. Every safeguard, every precaution, every structure built to prevent exactly this had failed, not through any flaw in the system itself, but because of one detail that had not been in any calculation. A 17-year-old Omega, with a perfect memory and nothing to lose, who had looked at his skin and seen not damage, but information. Kale watched that understanding arrive in Vorn's expression. He did not feel satisfaction. He felt the clean, factual sensation of something arriving at the conclusion it had been moving toward since the night in the side room when Vorn had reached across a table to sign papers, and his sleeve had shifted for 4 seconds. The entire network, Vorn said. Yes, Kale said. Vorn looked at the map on the wall of the study, the official map of the Eastern Territories that showed none of what his operation actually was. Then he looked back at Kale. My skin, he said, quietly. Understanding the full shape of it now. Your skin, Kale said. Vorn sat back in his chair, with the look of a man doing mathematics that produced only one result, no matter how many times you ran the numbers. All right, Vorn said. He sat, and he began to talk. It took 3 days. In those 3 days, the compound was transformed. The people who had been held there organized themselves, which was what people did when the structure that had been keeping them in place was removed, and they found that they had preferences and capabilities that the structure had been suppressing. Beth's kitchen produced meals at regular intervals for a growing number of people arriving from the outpost locations. The external spaces were claimed by people who wanted to be outdoors after years of controlled interiors. Neil, a man in his 30s, who had been in the compound for over a year, began helping with the organization of records on the 3rd day. He had a facility with numbers that became evident, immediately, when Claire put a ledger in front of him and asked him to verify the financial figures against Vorn's testimony. He found 4 discrepancies in an hour, each one pointing to a connection outside the Eastern Territories that Vorn had not yet mentioned. Claire brought those discrepancies to the next session with Vorn, and he filled them in, one by one, with the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised at the thoroughness of the people across from him. Iris, a young woman who had arrived at the compound in the same batch as Owen, turned out to have detailed knowledge of the territory north of Asveth. She had grown up there. She sat with Kale for an afternoon and added to the map sections that had been outside Vorn's network, and therefore blank. The additions she made were detailed enough that Kale added them to his own internal record. Every person who arrived from the outpost locations over the following days brought something. Information, skills, connections, perspectives that filled in gaps in the picture of what had been happening in the Eastern Territories for the past 30 years and longer. Rael spent those days meeting all of them. Not formally, not in a staged way. He moved through the compound and into the surrounding area, talking to people and listening more than he talked, building a picture of the present from the sources that were actually living in it. He came back to Kale each evening. This was not something either of them had discussed or arranged. It began happening on the 2nd day after the strikes, when Rael came to the room where Kale was working, and sat down and said, "Tell me what you observed today," and Kale told him, and they talked until the lamp needed oil. On the 3rd evening, Rael told Kale about the curse. They were in the courtyard, and Rael spoke about it without being asked, which told Kale that Rael had been deciding whether to say it for some time, and had arrived at the decision. The curse was made specific, Rael said, not general. The people who made it were careful about what it required for the seal to break. The warnings on the door said an unbonded Omega, Kale said. More specific than that, Rael said. An Omega who entered the sealed space freely. Not driven there, not hiding, not seeking shelter as a destination. Someone using the border as a means to reach something beyond it. Kale looked at him. I was running from Vorn's pursuit team, he said. You were using Veilthorn as a route, Rael said, not as a hiding place. Your destination was beyond the border. The forest was the path, not the goal. Kale was quiet for a moment, turning that over. It was precise, and it was accurate. He had chosen the forest because it was the only route his pursuers would not follow. His goal had always been the other side. The curse was designed to wait for someone who was moving towards something, Rael said, not away from something. Those are usually the same thing, Kale said. They are, Rael said, but the design required that the primary orientation was forward. Kale sat with that for a moment. You knew this when I first told you why I chose that border, he said. The first day, Rael said. You did not say anything. You did not ask, Rael said. They were both quiet for a while. The night around them was clear and full of the sounds of the territory settling into sleep. Ask me what you want to ask, Rael said. Kale looked at him. Who put the crossing point on your skin? He said. The one that led to the sealed chamber. It was older than everything else on you. Rael was quiet for a moment. My mother, he said, before the curse. She knew the notation system. She marked it on me when I was young, when I first began working against the slavers of my time, and she wanted me to have a record of safe passage points that could not be taken from me. Kale was very still. The full weight of that settled over him slowly. Rael's mother had put a map on her son's skin for the same reason the crossing point had been on Vorn's, because a map on a person's skin could not be seized. The things a person carried in their own body were the most difficult things to take away. The same principle, used for opposite purposes. She designed the crossing point, Kale said. She did, Rael said. She put it there as a last resort, in case the worst happened and someone, eventually, needed to find their way to what was inside the sealed chamber. She expected someone to find it, Kale said. She trusted the conditions she designed, Rael said. She said that a person who met all of them would be the right person. Not because of what they were, but because of how they moved through the world. Forward, Kale said. Always forward, Rael said. He looked at Kale directly. She would have liked you, he said. She valued precision and people who answered questions the way they were actually asked. Kale did not respond immediately. He was not sure what to say, and saying nothing was still almost always more accurate than saying something incorrect. You said you would ask me again when it was done, Kale said. Rael looked at him. About the second name, Kale said. It is done, Rael said. Yes, Kale said. It is. The silence between them was a different kind of silence than any they had shared in the castle, or the working sessions, or the corridor outside the sealed chamber. It was not the silence of two people still being careful with each other. It was the silence of two people who had been careful with each other for long enough, and were now on the other side of that particular kind of careful. Kale Valethorn, Rael said. Kale let the name settle. Tried it. Found that it fit in a way that was difficult to explain precisely, and did not require explanation. That is very presumptuous, he said. Yes, Rael said. It is. A pause. The night around them breathed. All right, Kale said. The sun came up on a different world. That was what it felt like to the people who came out of holding areas and assigned rooms and carefully managed routines and walked into the morning air of a compound where the people who had kept them there were no longer in charge. It did not feel dramatic. Kale had expected it might feel more dramatic, and then he understood, watching it happen, that the absence of drama was exactly the point. Drama was what happened in stories. In reality, what happened when something ended was that people stood in the morning air and looked around and tried to determine what the rules were now, and in the absence of the old rules, they found that the world was still there, and still working, and that they were still breathing, and the sun still came up. The strikes across the network had reached their targets simultaneously in the night. Word came back in pieces over the following hours, carried by the people Claire had organized for exactly this purpose. Northern segment, cleared. Southern hub, cleared. 3 secondary outposts, cleared. The remaining outposts, cleared by mid-morning. The coordination had not been perfect, because nothing was ever perfect, but it had been close enough. The window had held. The timing had delivered what it was supposed to deliver. Vorn's empire, built over 3 decades, and sustained through fear and the absence of anywhere safe to go, had taken one night to bring down. Vorn himself was brought before Rael in the main hall of the compound at midday. He walked in under his own ability, because Rael had not ordered him dragged or treated with visible degradation. Kale had noted that instruction when it was given. The absence of humiliation was not mercy for Vorn's sake. It was a statement about the kind of authority making the decisions. Men who needed to demonstrate power through the humiliation of prisoners were men who were not certain of the power they held. Rael was not that kind of man. Vorn stood in the hall and looked at Rael across 20 feet of floor. Cale stood to Rael's right. "Your network is finished," Rael said. "Every location on it was taken last night. Every person being held is now free to go where they choose. Your lieutenants are in custody, and will remain so until the full extent of their knowledge and involvement is determined." Vorn looked at Cale for a moment, then back at Rael. "You have a choice," Rael continued. "You can provide full accounts of every operation you ran, every person moved through your network, every connection outside the Eastern Territories, and every financial arrangement that supported the organization. Or you can decline, and we will construct those accounts from the records in your compound and from the testimony of the people you held. The difference will be in how long the process takes, not in the outcome." Vorn looked at the map laid out on the table to his left, the map that Claire's people had drawn from the notation Cale provided. Every route, every location, every crossing. His network, reproduced in full from the memory of someone he had purchased and brought into his own compound. "My skin," Vorn said quietly. He was still processing the full shape of it. "Your skin," Cale said. Vorn looked at Cale with an expression that had moved past anger and past calculation into something that was almost, in a strange way, a kind of acceptance, not of what was happening to him now, but of the specific mechanism that had brought it about. He had built the map on his body because paper could be taken. He had believed that information no one else could see was information no one else could use. He had not thought about someone who could see everything once and never lose it. He had not thought about Cale. "All right," Vorn said. He sat down. He began to talk. It took 3 days. In those 3 days, the compound transformed. The people who had been held there organized themselves, which was what people did when the structure that had been keeping them in place was removed, and they found that they had preferences and capabilities that the structure had been suppressing. Beth's kitchen produced meals at regular intervals for a growing number of people arriving from the outpost locations. The external spaces were claimed by people who wanted to be outdoors after years of controlled interiors. Neil, a man in his 30s who had been in the compound for over a year, and who said almost nothing for the first 2 days, began helping with the organization of records on the 3rd day. He had a facility with numbers that became evident when Claire put a ledger in front of him and asked him to verify the financial figures against Vorn's testimony. He found 4 discrepancies in an hour, each one pointing to a connection outside the Eastern Territories that Vorn had not yet mentioned. Claire brought those discrepancies to the next session with Vorn, and he filled them in, one by one, with the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised at the thoroughness of the people across from him. Iris, a young woman who had arrived at the compound in the same batch as Owen, turned out to have detailed knowledge of the territory north of Asveth. She had grown up there. She sat with Cale for an afternoon and added to the map sections that had been outside Vorn's network and therefore blank. The additions she made were detailed enough that Cale incorporated them into his own internal record. Every person who arrived from the outpost locations over the following days brought something: information, skills, connections, perspectives that filled in gaps in the picture of what had been happening in the Eastern Territories for the past 30 years and longer. Rael spent those days meeting all of them. Not formally. He moved through the compound and into the surrounding area, talking to people and listening more than he talked, building a picture of the present from the sources that were actually living in it. He came back to Cale each evening. This was not something either of them had arranged. It began happening on the 2nd day after the strikes, when Rael came to the room where Cale was working and sat down and said, "Tell me what you observed today," and Cale told him, and they talked until the lamp needed oil. On the 3rd evening, Rael told Cale about the curse. They were in the courtyard, the first clear night sky Cale had seen without a wall nearby since before Asveth, and Rael spoke about it without being asked. The curse was made specific, Rael said. Not general. The people who made it were careful about what it required for the seal to break. The warnings on the door said an unbonded Omega, Cale said. More specific than that, Rael said. An Omega who entered the sealed space freely. Not driven there, not hiding, not seeking shelter as a destination, someone using the border as a means to reach something beyond it. Kale looked at him. I was running from Vorn's pursuit team, he said. You were using Valethorn as a route, Rael said. Not as a hiding place. Your destination was beyond the border. The forest was the path, not the goal. Kale was quiet for a moment. It was precise, and it was accurate. He had chosen the forest because it was the only route his pursuers would not follow. His goal had always been the other side. The curse was designed to wait for someone who was moving towards something, Rael said. Not away from something. Those are usually the same thing, Kale said. They are, Rael said. But the design required that the primary orientation was forward. Kale sat with that for a moment. You knew this when I first told you why I chose that border, he said. The first day, Rael said. You did not say anything. You did not ask, Rael said. They were both quiet for a while. Ask me what you want to ask, Rael said. Kale looked at him. Who put the crossing point on your skin, he said. The one that led to the sealed chamber. It was older than everything else on you. Rael was quiet for a moment. My mother, he said, before the curse. She knew the notation system. She marked it on me when I was young, when I first began working against the slavers of my time, and she wanted me to have a record of safe passage points that could not be taken from me. Kale was very still. The full weight of that settled over him slowly. Rael's mother had put a map on her son's skin for the same reason, because a map on a person's skin could not be seized. The same principle, used for opposite purposes. She designed the crossing point, Kale said. She did, Rael said. She put it there as a last resort. In case the worst happened and someone, eventually, needed to find their way to what was inside the sealed chamber. She trusted the conditions, Kale said. She trusted the kind of person the conditions described, Rael said. She said that a person who met all of them would be the right person, not because of what they were, but because of how they moved through the world. Forward, Kale said. Always forward, Rael said. He looked at Kale directly. She would have liked you, he said. She valued precision, and people who answered questions the way they were actually asked. Kale was quiet for a moment. You said you would ask me again when it was done, Kale said. Rael looked at him. About the second name, Kale said. It is done, Rael said. Yes, Kale said. It is. The silence between them was a different kind of silence, not the silence of two people still being careful with each other. The silence of two people who had been careful with each other for long enough, and were now on the other side of that. Kale Valethorn, Rael said. Kale let the name settle, found that it fit in a way that did not require explanation. That is very presumptuous, he said. Yes, Rael said. It is. A pause. All right, Kale said. Valethorn was rebuilt slowly and on purpose. Rael had said, early in the days after the strikes, that what they were building was not meant to happen quickly. Things built quickly were things built on the needs of the immediate moment, rather than on foundations meant to outlast the people who laid them. The people who had been freed from the network came to Valethorn at their own pace. Some arrived immediately, drawn to the only place they had been told was safe, and finding that the description was accurate. Some came weeks later, after traveling back to places they had known before, and finding those places changed, or unreachable, or simply no longer the right answer for who they were now. Some came months later, after sorting through their options with care. The forest, which Kale had expected might remain difficult, was different for people who came with permission and purpose. The territory beyond it, which had been outside any network's range for 3 centuries, was larger than anyone had mapped. The land was intact in the way that land was intact when no one had worked it badly for a very long time. There was room. That was the simplest way to say it. There was room for people who needed it, which was not a thing that had been reliably true in the Eastern Territories for a very long time. The castle was not the only structure in Valethorn. The 347 people who had slept in it had known the territory when it was inhabited, and they knew where the old settlements had been, and what the land could support, and where the water ran in the right seasons. They began the work of rebuilding with the knowledge of people who had done it once, and retained every detail of how. Claire organized the settlement logistics with the same decisive efficiency that characterized everything she did. She had a particular ability to understand how many people a given system could support before it needed to expand, which was not a skill that could be easily taught, and which turned out to be exactly what was needed most. She and Cale worked alongside each other on the administrative structure, and their working relationship was efficient and occasionally competitive, in a way that was productive rather than problematic. They disagreed sometimes, argued the disagreement to its natural conclusion, and arrived at the better answer. Neil handled the financial structure of the settlement. He built a system that could track resources across a growing population without becoming the kind of system that served the people running it more than the people it was supposed to serve. Claire reviewed his work and revised it twice, and both revisions were improvements. Neil accepted the revisions without complaint and incorporated them without losing any of the structural logic he had built in the first place, which told Cale something useful about how Neil operated. Iris mapped the territory. She walked it systematically, starting from the castle and expanding outward in sections, and she came back from each section with maps that were better than anything that had existed for Valethorn before, because she mapped what was actually there, rather than what historical records said should be there. She found water sources that were not in any record. She found ruins of settlements that no one had documented. She found a southern pass through the territory's edge that opened up a connection to territories that had previously been entirely disconnected from Valethorn, which changed the settlement's reach significantly and required a revision of the initial resource allocation plan. Owen built the security system. He approached it the way he had approached watching guard rotations in Vorn's compound, systematically and without unnecessary drama, with a clear preference for systems that ran on consistency and did not require visible threat to function. The security of Valethorn looked, from a certain angle, almost completely invisible. It was there, and it was effective, but it did not present itself the way that security in a place built on control presented itself. It did not announce itself to the people living inside it, because the people living inside it were not the problem the security was designed to address. Beth's kitchen became the center of the settlement, in a way that had nothing to do with food, though the food was always very good. It became the room where more decisions were made than any of the formal meeting spaces, because people came to it for meals, and stayed, because the conversation there was honest and direct, and because Beth ran it with the same measured attention she had applied to everything for years, and people found that atmosphere easy to think in. Gwen's signal system was adapted and expanded by the people from Rail's original group who had experience in long-distance communication, and it became the primary method by which the settlement's outer areas and the castle stayed in contact. It worked reliably at distances that would have required written messages and days of travel in any other system. Rail named Cale First Council of Valethorn in the 3rd month. He did it at a gathering of the people of this territory. Not a court, not a formal ceremony, just people in a large room together, addressing the things that needed addressing. First Council is a role that carries specific responsibilities, Rail said to the room. It means this person's judgment is my second judgment. In situations where my judgment is not immediately available, it operates in its place. It means this person has access to every level of every decision made in this territory, and carries the authority to act on those decisions when circumstances require speed. It means this person's voice in any discussion is the voice I have asked to be present in that discussion. He looked at Cale. You can decline, he said. You know I am not going to decline, Cale said. Something that was not quite a smile, but lived close to one, crossed Rail's face. Then it is done, he said. The room did not react dramatically. Some people nodded. Claire inclined her head, because she had known this was coming since the 2nd week. Neil did the same, because he had worked it out from the administrative patterns before Claire had, and had simply been waiting for the official announcement. Iris smiled at Cale from across the room, and then went back to the map she was reviewing, because Iris was a person who understood that the most appropriate response to good news was to keep doing the work. Cale looked at the room, at the people in it, at what it represented, which was the gathered result of everything that had been set in motion by a small and deliberate act of observation in a room lit by oil lamps in the trade city of Asveth, when a man who thought no one was paying attention to him signed a document and his sleeve shifted for 4 seconds. He thought about Nora, who had left the compound in the first hours after the strikes and gone north toward territory she had told Cale she came from. The last word they had of her was that she had arrived somewhere and stopped, which seemed like the right outcome for a person who had been waiting for somewhere to stop for a very long time. He thought about Lena and Ren, who had turned back from the forest on the 3rd night. They had reached the North Territory, as Cale had told them was possible, and a messenger had come south, with a brief account of their arrival, and a single-line addition at the bottom, in handwriting Cale recognized as Lena's. It said, "You were right about the difference." He had not been sure, when he read it, exactly which difference she meant. He thought she probably meant all of them. That evening, after the gathering, Cale and Rael walked the outer wall of the settlement. The wall was not the wall of Vorn's compound. It had a different feeling to it, the feeling of something that defined a space rather than contained one, which was a distinction that mattered more in practice than it sounded like it would. "The border Vorn marked on his skin," Cale said. They were walking the eastern side, which faced the forest. "The crossing point your mother put on you." They pointed to the same location. "Yes," Rael said. "Your mother put it there. As a last resort," Cale said. "Vorn had it from someone who knew the territory, and marked it as a point of interest, something sealed and significant. He never used it, because he never needed to." "Yes," Rael said. "The same location," Cale said, "for two completely different reasons." Rael looked at him. "What are you thinking about?" he said. Cale considered how to say it. "I am thinking about the fact that I memorized a map from a terrible person's skin in order to find a way out," he said, "and that the way out was a crossing point put there by your mother long before I was born, and that the reason no one in the slaving network had ever used that crossing point was because the things sealed on the other side of it made the entire territory feel dangerous enough to avoid, and that if they had not been afraid of Valethorn, you would have stayed sealed indefinitely." "Yes," Rael said. "But because they were afraid," Cale said, "no one ever went in. And because no one ever went in, you stayed sealed. And because you stayed sealed, the boundary held. And because the boundary held, there was a place to go that was outside the range of everything they ran." Rael was quiet for a moment. "My mother said that a curse used for the right purpose was not a curse at all," he said. "She said the difference between a curse and a protection was entirely in what it kept safe, and for whom." Cale looked at the forest, at the dark edge of it under the evening sky, solid and old and still serving the purpose it had served for 300 years. "She was right," he said. "She usually was," Rael said. They walked the rest of the eastern wall in a silence that was comfortable in the specific way that silence between people who were no longer being careful with each other was comfortable. The forest was on one side of the wall, and the settlement was on the other, and the wall itself was the definition of the space between them, the line that said, "Here is where something is different. Here is where the rules are other rules. Here is where the territory belongs to the people in it, and not to the people who want to take from them." That was what a border meant when it was the right kind. Not a barrier built to keep people in. Not a line drawn by people who feared what was on the other side. A definition. A statement about what was here and what was not. Cale had memorized his way to this border in the dark, following marks cut into skin by a person who thought they were building an empire, and he had walked through the crossing point on the other side of that empire's fear, without knowing what was waiting inside. He knew now. He was standing in it. The first full season in Valethorn settled over the territory in a way that felt deliberate. The forest changed with the temperature, which Cale had not expected from something that had seemed, when he first walked through it, to be permanently the same shade of dark and the same quality of quiet. It turned out the forest had seasons the same as any other forest. The difference was that its seasons felt more pronounced, as if 300 years of change had been stored up and was now being expressed all at once. The settlement expanded in stages that Claire had planned, and that proceeded more or less according to plan, with the adjustments that all plans required when they met the specific reality of a specific place and specific people. The second cluster of buildings went up on the north side of the castle, which turned out to have better drainage than the original estimate suggested. The third cluster went further north, where Iris had found the water source that the historical records had not documented, and which turned out to be more reliable across seasons than the source the original settlement had relied on. People came. They came from the Eastern Territories first, because the Eastern Territories were the ones that had been most directly affected by the network, and because word moved fastest along routes that had been established, even if the purpose of those routes was now very different from what it had been. They came singly, and in small groups, mostly, which was how people who had been in the kinds of situations these people had been in tended to move, carefully, without advertising themselves. Each person who arrived was met and assessed, not in any formal way, but in the practical way of a settlement that needed to know what skills it had and what skills it still needed. Claire managed this with the same practical efficiency she applied to everything. She was not warm in the way that some people were warm, but she was consistently fair and consistently clear, and both of those things turned out to matter more to the people arriving than warmth would have anyway. Cale spent his first months as first counsel doing work that was, on its surface, not very different from the work he had done in Vorn's compound. He maintained records, he prepared documents, he sat in on conversations, and wrote things down. The difference was not in the tasks but in what the tasks were in service of, and in the fact that the information he was working with was information he had chosen to work with, rather than information he had been placed in proximity to for someone else's purposes. He was also, in those first months, doing something he had not done for years. He was thinking about things other than the immediate problem of survival. Not all the time. Survival was still a thing that required attention, just in a different and more tractable form. But there were hours, increasingly, in which the problem of survival was adequately managed, and the mind could move in other directions. He thought about what he had read, in the years before everything changed, and found that a great deal of it was more useful now than it had been when he read it. He thought about the notation system he had learned from the merchant's library, and about all the other systems he had absorbed from those 4 months of reading, and about how many of those systems had direct applications to the problems of building something, rather than simply moving through something that already existed. He thought about Rael's mother, who had designed a crossing point that waited 300 years for the right person to use it, and who had known, somehow, what kind of person the right person would be. Not a hero, not a warrior, someone who was always moving towards something. He found that he thought about this quite often. He also found that he thought, quite often and in a way that was harder to categorize, about the conversation in the courtyard on the third evening after the strikes, and about the name that had been offered to him, and that he had accepted, and about what it meant to be offered a name by someone who had been asleep for 300 years, and who had used the first days of being awake to understand a world that was completely different from the one he had known before, and who had, in the middle of all of that, still found the time to say, "I would like to give you one." Rael moved through the settlement, and through the territory around it, with the same quality of attention he had applied to everything since the moment he woke up. He met the people who arrived, and he listened to what they said, and he paid attention to what they did not say, which was often more informative. He worked with Claire on the structural decisions of the settlement, and with Owen on the security system, and with Neil on the financial framework, and with Iris on the territorial mapping, and he brought to each of those conversations the specific quality of his attention that Cale had first observed in the sealed chamber, the ability to receive information and place it correctly in relation to everything else he knew, rapidly and without losing the detail in the process. He was also, Cale observed, working on something that he had not made explicit but that was visible in how he spent his time and where he chose to be. He was building an understanding of the present that was not filtered through the past. He was not trying to make the present look like what Valethorn had been before the curse. He was learning what it actually was and working from there. Cale appreciated this for practical reasons, and for other reasons that were harder to articulate, but that had something to do with the fact that a man, who could have spent his first waking months insisting on the restoration of everything, exactly as it had been, was instead asking what would be useful now, and that this was a quality that seemed to him both rare and correct. On an evening in the middle of the second month, Cale was in the study that had become the room where they did the majority of their work, and the majority of their talking about things that were not work, when Rael came in and sat down and said, "I want to tell you something about the curse. Something I have been thinking about since the night we talked about it." "Tell me," Cale said. "The condition was not just that an unbonded Omega entered the space freely," Rael said. "The condition was also that the person who entered had to be, in some way that the curse's design could recognize, not alone in the decision. Moving towards something, yes, but not moving towards something with no one else in mind." Cale looked at him. "I brought 5 people with me into the forest," he said. "Yes," Rael said, "and 2 more who turned back before you reached the castle. You did not go alone, and you did not intend to go alone. The plan from the beginning was to take as many people as would come with you. Cale was quiet for a moment, thinking about this. Your mother designed that into the condition, he said. She believed that a person moving toward something purely for themselves was a person who was still, in some essential way, running from something, Rael said. She wanted someone who was moving toward something that included other people. Cale thought about the 7 people who had walked out of Vorn's compound together on a night with no wind, and about Lena and Ren who had turned back and still made it somewhere safe, and about Nora who had gone north and stopped somewhere, and about the people in the sealed chamber who had chosen to wait, and about the 347 people who had woken up and started building something, and about the people who kept arriving in Valethorn and finding room. She was right to design that in, Cale said. She was right about most things, Rael said. She was particularly right about the things she did not live to see resolved. They sat for a while in the quiet of the study. The lamp burned steadily. Outside, the settlement was in the particular kind of active quiet that settlements were in the evenings, when the working part of the day was done, and the social part of the evening was beginning, and the two overlapped in ways that were comfortable, rather than conflicted. First Council, Rael said. It was the formal title, and it was also not exactly a formal use of it. Yes, Cale said. What are you thinking about? Rael said. Borders, Cale said. Rael looked at him. I have been thinking about what makes a border real, Cale said. Not in the legal sense, in the practical sense, what makes the difference between a line that holds and a line that doesn't. What have you concluded? Rael said. Cale thought about it for a moment. He had been working toward this conclusion for several weeks and was not entirely sure he had it in a form that would hold up to examination, but he was going to say it anyway. A border holds when the people on the inside of it have chosen to be there, Cale said, when the definition of what is here and what is not is something that the people inside agree with, when the border is not keeping anyone in, but is simply marking where something different begins. He paused. A border built to keep people in is always breaking, because the people inside are always testing it. A border built to define a territory that the people inside have chosen is different. It holds not because of force, but because of what the people inside understand about why it is there. Rael looked at him for a long moment. That is what my mother was trying to build, he said, when she designed the boundary around Valethorn. I know, Cale said. That is what we are trying to build now. Rael was quiet. We are doing it, he said finally, not as a question, as an observation. Yes, Cale said, I think we are. They walked the eastern wall again that evening, the way they often did. The forest stood on the other side of it, old and patient and entirely itself, the way it had been for 300 years, and would presumably continue to be for a very long time after this evening. Cale looked at it and thought about the night he had stood at its edge, with 6 other people, and looked into the dark of it, and chosen to go in. He thought about the map he had memorized from marks on a terrible person's skin, and about the crossing point that had been waiting for exactly the right person to use it, and about the door that had opened when he pressed his palm against it, and about the man who had been sealed behind it for 300 years, and who was standing beside him now. He thought about all of the distance between the auction pit in Asveth and this moment on this wall, and about how much of that distance he had covered by paying attention, by remembering everything, by always looking forward when the easier thing would have been to stop. The border was always going to be the point, Cale said. Yes, Rael said. I just did not know what was on the other side of it. No, Rael said, but you walked through it anyway. I always move forward, Cale said. I know, Rael said. He said it with the steadiness of someone who had been paying attention since the moment he opened his eyes, in a sealed chamber, and found a 17-year-old standing in the pale light, looking back at him without fear. That is why it worked. The lamp in the settlement burned behind them. The forest breathed ahead, and Valethorn continued its long, careful work of becoming the thing it had been waiting 300 years to become. One day at a time. One person at a time. One chosen decision at a time. In the territory that had finally remembered its name. The borders held. Not because they were feared, because they were chosen. And that, in the end, was the only kind of border that ever truly held at all.